Welcome to HY302. We will now begin a new module, and this week's topic will look at the idea of turbulence. But before we do this, let's review what we learnt in the first module so far. We spent quite a bit of time in this course looking at the events and individuals from 1874 to 1900. The reason we do this is that some of these foundational policies will have lasting effects on the future of the colony of Fiji and also on independent Fiji right up to the present. In week 2, we looked at the signing of the deed of cession, and you might have heard of the famous quote, "History is written by the victors." Well, in that case, we know that the victors in the deed of cession have tended to document the history of that period. But we've also questioned in that class who the quote-unquote losers were in 1874, referring to those people who were opposed to the signing of the deed of cession, who did not actually concede to give their sovereignty to the British, and who were disadvantaged by that as a result. In week 3, we considered the measles epidemic, and one of the key questions we asked was, which had the greater impact on Fiji's future? Was it the deed of cession, where a few men signed a document ratified by the British colonial government? Or was it a measles epidemic, which would kill almost a quarter of the population in a short period of time, and rapidly shape or reshape British ideas of how they would rule the colony in the future? We also begin to look at Sir Arthur Gordon, one of the early British colonial governors, who had two goals when he reached Fiji. One was to protect indigenous Fijians, at the time that were called natives, and the other was to make the colony profitable. And sometimes these two goals conflicted with each other. We discussed that in detail in week 4, which we described as the Gordon-Thurston settlement, because Gordon's policies to create a native administration, as it was called, were then taken up and expanded by Sir John Bates Thurston, a successive governor. Some of these policies would have ramifications for the indigenous Fijian population for the next 100 years. And they rested upon assumptions made by the British, including the idea of time immemorial. Peter France, a historian writing in 1969, has shown how the current land tenure system in Fiji was adopted as a protective device but is now regarded as tradition. We've also considered how Gordon's vision was not a static preservation of traditional society. His policies were only designed to be a temporary experiment, to give indigenous Fijians time to catch up with this rapidly changing world. Finally, we looked at the introduction of indentured labour. This included the Polynesian labour trade, which encompassed peoples from Polynesia and Melanesia who worked in Fiji plantations in the 19th century. But also we focused on the Indian experience of Girmit, as it was called. And there's a fascinating video by Professor Bridge V. Lau, a descendant of Girmitians, that can share with you what research has been done about this experience. The key point I've made there is that the Indian experience of Girmit was not the same for everyone, and there's a lot of nuances still left to explore in the historical research. But now let's introduce our next section, Turbulence and Reform, and this refers to a period from 1900 to 1945. Why might this period be considered turbulent? Perhaps you can pause the video here and think about some of the dot points which I've listed here, which may have affected Fijian society during this time period. Of course, the period 1900 to 1945 includes two global wars, World War I and World War II, which would involve not only British colonial populations, but also Fijian society, and would have ramifications for global trade and mobility. We also see another epidemic raging in Fiji and the nearby islands of Samoa and Tonga, and that's known as the influenza epidemic, or sometimes as the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was spread just at the end of World War I, when troops returning home from the front carried diseases with them, and those diseases reached islands like Fiji with devastating impacts. Although it was not as devastating as the measles epidemic of 1875, it nonetheless reminded Fijians of the unsatisfactory quarantine measures of the British colony in Fiji, and also the poor outcomes for health, sanitation, and governance within Fiji. As the disease spread, there was again panic, confusion, and many unnecessary deaths. And so it really raised questions about how satisfactory British rule was in the colony of Fiji and other nearby colonies. In 1929, Fiji was also affected by the Great Depression. At this time, it not only affected global prices for sugar and other valuable commodities, but it also restricted mobility. By this time, there were many profitable steamship routes traversing between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And many of them called upon Fiji and brought tourists to the economy. But the Great Depression impacted this. Transportation and industrial developments also have a major impact on reshaping Fijian society. In the previous century, when Gordon and Thurston were developing their policies, Indigenous Fijians were largely kept confined to their villages, and the general economy in Fiji was agricultural. But with progressive changes in transportation, including air and sea transportation, refrigeration, and the development of roads across the colony, it meant that people could move more easily within Fiji and beyond Fiji's borders through the Pacific. The sugar industry was also rapidly expanded as a result of Indian indentured labour, which was both cheap and easy to access. Over 60,000 Gamitias helped support this industry to grow, reaping huge profits for the British, but also reshaping the land as much land was cleared for sugar plantations. We also see the tourism industry beginning to grow, and other experiments in agricultural crops and manufacturing. And lastly, partly as a result of all these turbulences, but also as a result of the changing nature of Fijian society, the population of Fiji begins to change quite dramatically. And this has important ramifications for the policies that Gordon and Thurston first developed to govern the population of Fiji. So let's think about some of these demographic changes now. Contrary to early fears that the population of Fiji might die out as a result of the measles epidemic, from 1900 we see that the population begins to increase and spikes in the 1930s. How do we know? Well, there's a series of reports generated by the British Colonial Office in Fiji. Every 10 years they recorded a census, taking note of the number of people in Fiji their race, their gender, their age, and other vital statistics, which are very important for us to understand this period. We can also see court reports and colonial annual reports, which summarise what's happening in the colony for the British colonial officials back home. We also see the population of Indo-Fijians rapidly changing and growing. From 1900, the census documents tell us that Indo-Fijians numbered roughly 21,000. But by 1921, only 20 years later, they had increased to 60,000. By 1936, a number of years after the Indian indentured system had been ended, and many Indians were returned home to India, the population in Fiji continued to increase to 85,000, largely as a result of natural births, as many Indians decided to make Fiji their permanent home. We also see other migrant populations growing in number in Fiji. Rotumans were a distinct cultural group from a small island to the far north of Fiji. This island was ceded to Great Britain in 1881, and a resident commissioner was appointed to live there, and he reported to the governor in Suva. And so Rotuma was considered part of the colony of Fiji, and Rotumans could move freely between Rotuma and Fiji. In the 1930s, Rotumans numbered roughly 2,000, but like the Indo-Fijians, their numbers would steadily increase. We also see other migrant populations, including other Pacific Islanders. Some of these were descendants of the Kai Solomoni, who came to Fiji as labourers, while others may have migrated for other reasons. The majority of the Kai Solomoni were male, and at the time when they arrived, they were considered Fijian by the British. Many decided to stay in Fiji and intermarried with Fijian people, and so in census records they're often considered part of the Fijian population. They numbered approximately 20,000 in Fiji until the early 1900s, but statistics measuring them have changed over time as they continue to grow. Chinese were another distinct group reported in the census. Initially they were a very small group, only 30 men and 1 woman reported in 1888, but by 1910 they had grown to 910. Initially they were merchants and businessmen, the majority of whom were male, but again their families would expand and grow over time. The final population that would start to rapidly change were the Kailomas, a term to refer to those of mixed parentage. Quite often it were children of a Fijian mother and a European father. Sometimes the British would call them part Europeans. And already by 1901 they had numbered almost 1,500 and grew to almost 3,000 by 1921. Kailomas would pose some new challenges to the British colonial rule because they sat awkwardly on this racial distinction, not quite Fijian and not quite European. And that confounded European authorities who didn't quite know how to deal with them. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I just wanted to highlight some wonderful studies already existing about these migrant groups. Bessie Ali has a book in the USP library all about the Chinese in Fiji, and there are some long-standing Chinese merchant shops in Fiji today. Winston Halapua and Anna Matandrandra have done some wonderful work on the Solomon Islanders and other New Hebridean labourers who lived in Fiji. And you can access this research at the USP library, but there's also some wonderful resources on museum websites and online archives like this one from the New Zealand Te Papa Museum